So here would be an example of some of these ideas. Password authentication. Well, here's the people part. People aren't very good at memorizing complicated things. So we can ask you to generate a strong password. It's really long. It's got multiple special characters. It's hard to guess. And you can try to memorize that. But it's unlikely you're going to be able to do that and memorize a different one for every site you use. So what do people typically do? Is like a common thing is they'll choose one password that's pretty decent and then use it on a whole bunch of sites. So how many of you like reuse a password across multiple sites? Sure, of course you do. Because like what else are you going to do? You're not going to memorize a whole bunch of passwords. Like it's not realistic. So the consequence of that from a security perspective is that this introduces a kind of a very common risk, which is you have the same password used on a whole bunch of different sites. One of those sites has weak security and gets hacked. The hackers download the database of all the passwords, and now they've got the email address and the password of all those users, and then they start trying those on other services. Okay? So this is one of the very common ways that people's like accounts online get compromised is through a breach of one site leading to compromise on another site. All right, so that's kind of the problem we have today, which is sort of a consequence of the fact that the design of how we do password authentication doesn't really take into account kind of the human factors of what our capabilities are. So how do you solve that? Well, there's two kind of state-of-the-art solutions out there. One is use a password manager. Right? So like you can have your browser remember your passwords for you, or get a separate piece of software that remembers your passwords for you. And then that way, that software can generate a different password for every site, make it be a good one, and it's different for every, and you don't have to remember it because the software will remember it for you. And if you're worried that like, if your roommate gets access to your computer, they're going to be able to get to all your accounts, what you can do is you can choose a single master password that you use to like unlock your password manager and unlocks all of those site passwords. And so then you only have to memorize one password, the master password, and the computer remembers all the rest for you. So if you don't use the password managers today, they're great. You should use them. They're good for security. I saw a hand. Uh-huh.
So say if it's my bank account, I don't memorize my password for my bank account.
Yeah.
Because if I'm always logged into Chrome, I don't want people to just go log on to my bank website and then just click the enter button.
Yep. You don't want someone else who gets their hands on your computer to be able to get on your bank account that easily. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And defenses against that would be master password, not having it remember your bank account password, or the next thing I was going to raise would be two-factor authentication. Okay, so two-factor authentication is another thing that really helps against these problems where if you have a CalNet account, you can have two-factor authentication, and there's an app on my phone. I guess my phone's over there, so I went to reach for it. To log in to CalNet, then I have to enter in both my password, and then I have to click OK in my app to prove that I control the phone. Okay? So the great thing about two-factor authentication now is that someone who knows my password but doesn't have my phone can't get into my account. Okay? So like someone on the other side of the world who happens to have guessed my password, if I happen to choose a guessable password, if they don't have their hands on my phone, they're not getting in. And someone who's stolen my phone, or if I lost my phone, someone who's got their hands on my phone but doesn't know my password is not getting in. They can only get in if they've got both of them. So this helps a lot. It helps against phishing attacks. This is a great defense. So if you want to protect yourself, also two-factor auth is great. Yeah.
What if my family uses this certain ID, Apple ID, and then I'm like, okay, I'm over here and they're in Concord, and I need to access something. Now I have to go hunt around who got the two-factor authentication now.
Great. I don't have my phone with me. Oh no, I can't get into my services. What would you call that? I don't know, but it's not exactly a detector, but that sounds kind of like, it's kind of like this false positive, false negative dichotomy, right? Where I've made it less likely that attackers are going to get in, but I've made it more likely that I can't get in when I need to. So here's that trade-off again. Yep. Yeah, in the back.
So what would you say the differences in password managers within the browser versus on the actual machine itself?
Yeah, password managers implement the browser versus a separate piece of software.
Yeah.
For purposes of this discussion, the differences are probably not substantial. You can go read, they'll have features and whatever, but basically what's happened is that browsers have started more and more to emulate the most common, most popular features of major third-party password managers, like ability to sync your passwords across multiple devices and so on. So, from a fundamental perspective, there's not necessarily, doesn't have to be any real difference. Another question? Yeah? Yeah, password hashing. Oh, good. You know about password hashing. So we'll talk about password hashing when we get to crypto. The password hashing was a mechanism that was intended to deal with that threat that I mentioned up there about compromising your password on one site being used to log you in another one. And it works great if your password is really hard to guess. But it has to be really hard to guess. And the problem is that most people's passwords are only somewhat hard to guess. And as a result, password hashing, it turns out, doesn't work very well for that. So password hashing is somewhat effective, but it's usually not, it doesn't really solve the problem. And yeah. We'll talk more about it when we get to crypto. Yes? How does two-factor authentication protect against phishing attacks? In a phishing attack, the phisher might be trying to learn my bank password, my password to my bank account, by sending me an email that convinces me to go to a page that I think is the bank and type in my password there. Let's suppose the attacker succeeds at that, and the attacker now knows my bank password. If I have two-factor auth enabled, that's not enough for the attacker to then log into my bank account and drain my funds, because the attacker doesn't have access to my phone. One last question, then I want to move on. Yep. Go ahead.
If you're logging into a website, it's a phishing website, and it looks like the real website.
Yep.
And in the process of logging in, it just asks you for the 2 auth code because on the back end they're just logged into the website. Wouldn't that circumvent?
Yeah, that's sometimes called man in the middle or man in the browser attack. You're right, and it depends exactly on how the two-factor auth is implemented, and there's different kind of levels. There's kind of different forms of two-factor auth, and some are better than others. And the most basic one is you get texted like a code. And if you get texted a code, then it is vulnerable to the attack you mentioned. And so the better ones actually will have like an app on your phone or a separate device that don't have that problem. Yeah. So it's possible to design two-factor auth in a way that it's really quite secure and doesn't have this problem. But good job spotting that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, totally.